How many people do you know these days with a neurological disorder? How many family members or people in your circle of friends have something like fibromyalgia or lupus? How about a brain tumor? Studies in the New England Journal of Medicine show a growing trend in the rate of such disorders in recent years. Perhaps like me, you've never given the issue much thought. But in 2002, I could no longer ignore it. I also became a statistic when I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. It was the summer of the Great Fire in Tucson, Arizona, when I began my research and traveled across this country to find the truth.
Well, yeah, the technology we have in looking at the brain has changed rather dramatically. Now, the increase in brain tumors has nothing to do with our ability to see these things, because that's been looked at. And the studies have shown that it's a real increase in brain tumors. It has nothing to do with our improvements in technology.
The National Cancer Institute recorded an impressive increase in incident rates of primary brain cancer since 1985, and possibly as early as 1984. Dr. H.J. Roberts, director for the Palm Beach Institute for Medical Research, found this trend particularly disturbing. At a time when this trend was singularly attributed to more innovative scanning and diagnostic procedures, Roberts noticed a series of conflicting themes. First, adequate brain scanning devices were widely available for at least 10 years prior to this report. Second, there were simply more people affected with brain cancer. They had nothing to do with the change in the way they were diagnosed or a different way of classifying the disease. Third, between 1983 and 1987, incidence of other forms of cancer outside the brain remained the same and, in some cases, declined. So why the vast increase in brain cancer and brain disorders since 1984? I'll refer to a published study by foremost neuroscientist Dr. John Olney. He suggests one likely candidate. In 1983, the U.S. population began ingesting significant quantities of a substance never before used for human consumption. Artificial sweetener aspartame was quickly introduced to consumers. In 1984, 6,900,000 pounds of aspartame was consumed by Americans. This rate doubles by the next year and continues to climb into the 90s.
When it was fully marketed for pop and everything by July to August of 1983, 6 months later, by 1984, the brain tumor rate had already jumped 10% in the United States. The diabetes rate had jumped 30%, and the incidence of brain lymphoma, a very aggressive and unusual type of brain tumor, jumped 60%.
The enormity of the problem is indicated by the fact that by 1988, in its own publication, 80% of complaints about food and additives that were volunteered to the FDA, and again, it didn't have to be submitted, had to deal with aspartame products, over 80%.
When you see these people who say, well, I take MSG or NutraSweet, it doesn't seem to bother me at all, they're more resistant to the obvious toxic effects, but they're still getting very subtle toxic effects that over many years is going to produce obvious disease in those persons.
Some persons can be exposed the first time and break up with a rash, have a terrible headache, and so they presumably have never been exposed to it before. But on the other hand, people who've taken it over the long term and exposing the body to large doses of the components of aspartame, then that's in the realm of toxicity.
And again, it's this variability in your sensitivity to toxins. Some people may notice very little, if anything. a majority of people will have one of a number of symptoms, because we know that the aspartame, because it is a poison that affects protein synthesis, because it affects how the synapse operates in the brain, and because it affects DNA, can affect numerous organs. So you can get a lot of different symptoms that seem unconnected. But in looking at the list of symptoms submitted to the FDA, most of them are neurological or in some way connected to the nervous system. So the nervous system seems to be one of the areas that's most affected. So we see people have difficulty thinking. They feel like they're walking around in a cloud or a fog.
It's a subchronic level. It's not like you go out and you drink a bottle of methanol and you have this acute reaction to it. What we're seeing over a period of time is this slow accumulation of toxins within the body that start to disrupt the normal activity of the brain and the endocrine system, which is controlled by the brain itself.
That really the sort of symptoms one can get are pretty protean. All types of symptoms can occur with aspartame. I mean, it clearly, so you need to look at the chemistry a little bit. I don't want to get too technical, but it clearly has an impact on what are called biogenic amines. These are, neurotransmitters in the brain, norepinephrine, serotonin. We've known for a long time that when you take in a lot of aspartame in conjunction with carbohydrates, you will decrease the availability of L-tryptophan, which is the building block for serotonin. There's been a lot of media attention recently to serotonin, a very, very important neurotransmitter, important in mood regulation and a variety of functions.
Aspartame is an artificial sweetener, an additive, and it's a chemical. It's not a natural product, it's a chemical. The molecule is made up of three components. Two are amino acids, the so-called building blocks of protein. One is called phenylalanine, which is about 50% of the molecule, and the other is aspartic acid, which is like 40%. The other 10% is a so-called methyl ester, which as soon as it's swallowed, becomes free methyl alcohol, methanol, wood alcohol, which is a poison, a real poison.
It really began with a patient. I had a patient whom I had treated for a number of years for a recurrent depression. She came into the hospital in what we call a manic state. That is, she was very, very speeded up, euphoric, on top of the world. I'd never seen her manic before, never looked upon her as bipolar. And within a day or two of her admission to the hospital, she had a sudden grand mal seizure, epileptic-like seizure. This is in a woman who had no history of seizure disorder. I really could not explain either the sudden onset of mania in somebody who'd been on antidepressants for years, usually in a bipolar patient, that is, in a manic depressive patient. An antidepressant will trigger a manic episode. She'd been on antidepressants for a long time, no manic episode. Suddenly was manic and then had a grand mal seizure. Clinically, I could not explain that, so we essentially did some detective work looking at what was different in this woman's life, and the only thing we could find was that she had made a decision to lose some weight. So she switched from iced tea sweetened with sugar to iced tea sweetened with aspartame. And she was drinking fairly large amounts of it. Now, you could speculate that perhaps the caffeine in the tea may have been a factor, but she had not changed the total quantity. She'd had this amount of iced tea for many years without manic episodes, without grand mal seizures. What was different was the aspartame. So I started looking at that, and it made sense that aspartame would lower the seizure threshold. That is, what we knew about the chemistry of aspartame at that point in time did point to the possibility that aspartame could, one, trigger a manic episode, and two, could lower the seizure threshold sufficiently for her to have a grand mal seizure. And that was the beginning. Then I found other patients like that and wrote about it. And that was in 1985, really 2 years or so after the introduction of aspartame into the market.
I realized that something was going awry, but I couldn't quite figure it out. And then after several years, amalgamating this experience and patient input, and it's very important that you listen to your patients, because the great Dr. Osler said, listen to the patient, they're telling you what's wrong. I realized that the common denominator was the use of aspartame products. And under various trade names, particularly NutraSweet, Equal, Crystallite, and so forth.
I was primarily using NutraSweet, lots of it, because I was a big coffee drinker. It was decaffeinated, I was taking care of myself.
I mean, there was just all kinds of things that, the diet sodas, I used to eat Jell-O all the time, Cool Whip and gum. I used to, chew gum constantly back then.
Came home and decided I was going to be the good diabetic. I needed to be here for my child. I was going to drink the diet drink like crazy. I drank Crystallite tea. I'd switched from brewing my own tea to Crystallite tea.
And so for years, I went on thinking, what a smart person I am, drinking Diet Coke instead of regular Coke. And also, I carried it into other things as well, so that when I would sweeten my tea, I'd sweeten it with Equal.
And so when the low-cal Kool-Aid hit the market in, I think it was April of 1983, I started using it.
I would have a drink with a Diet Coke. During the day I would drink Diet Coke or coffee, decaffeinated, all day long. I was never without one or the other. I drove 10 states. I always had a thermos of coffee with me, very liberally treated with NutraSweet.
I started out for doing blood draws, and I did the blood draws. I like talking and everything, and so that was a good area for me to get into. I was always hyper and all that, and I would drink the diet sodas like crazy there because we had it at our disposal all the time. And so the further and further I got on, and then I did Armed Forces Emergency Services with the disaster. We work with people overseas during wartime.
I grew up in a funeral home, and one of the oldest funeral homes in the South. I didn't meet my husband until I was like 35, 36. And we went on to have a child. And my weight just went way out of... And in the meantime, I had lost an eye in 87. I didn't meet him until 98. And I was told in 92 I had diabetes. Well, I tried staying off the sweets and the Coca-Cola and, drinking the diet drinks on and off. And
I was a briefing attorney for a federal district judge, John H. Wood. The U.S. courthouse in San Antonio is named after him. And then after serving as his briefing attorney for 2 years, I was appointed by Bill Sessions as assistant U.S. attorney for the Western District of Texas, and served in that capacity for a little bit over 4 years. And during that time, I was the president of the Federal Bar Association and very active in legal matters and things like that.
Had I seen the chemical formula on this product, I would never have touched it. The poisonous effect of methyl alcohol and its methyl esters are well known. And within a day or two of my starting to drink it, not only did I feel the deterioration in my body, where I couldn't swim anymore and I didn't have the balance that I had, and I was short of breath from a heart failure type of problem, but my wife saw all this much more objectively than I did, and she was a nurse, and she said, "Jim, get off of this. This is killing you. It's destroying you."
Well, I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease back in '93 called lupus, SLE, systemic, which I had been dealing with. It was very severe, to the point where I lost my job and eventually my insurance, because over 40 doctors who saw me over a year's period kept doing one test after another, and every test came back negative.
I've had symptoms since 1983. I can go back to as far as 1983, and possibly even before that, but I only remember doctor's offices and the hospitalizations and things like that since 1983.
Around, I'd say January of 2002, I started getting dizzy. I would go to the dryer to go take clothes out and fall down and not know why.
The reason I found out I had a brain tumor was I lost my voice during pollen season of the year 2000, or 98, excuse me. And in 98, my voice never came back from the pollen hoarseness that happened to me every year. So I went to a specialist at a local hospital here in Atlanta, and I said, all my friends' voices have come back, mine's gotten worse. And he went down my throat, and he said, well, your left vocal cord is completely atrophied, and it's been my experience when I see a condition like this that there's a brain tumor someplace that causes that.
Also the vision, having spots, and I couldn't see. And I literally stopped driving because I did not feel comfortable behind a wheel.
My endocrinologist told me that I most likely have multiple sclerosis, so he sent me to a neurologist. The neurologist told me that, yes, I do have multiple sclerosis.
I had been having double vision, and my doctor scheduled me to have an MRI. And we were waiting on the results, and I'll never forget it. It was, maybe a week or two before Christmas. And the doctor called, and I was just ready to hear, well, we couldn't find anything. Well, instead, he said, you have a brain tumor, and it's a rather large brain tumor.
And within a couple of days, I had gone from being a 2-mile-a-day swimmer to having such a toxic cardiomyopathy that I could hardly climb the stairs to my apartment. Over the next 6 weeks, I went through all of the personal hells of methyl alcohol poisoning and the neurotransmitter depletion from the aspartame's phenylalanine content, and eventually ended up with a picture of Lou Gehrig's disease.
I still have a lot of pain, but she said, well, you'll live with pain. It's part of, even though it's in remission, you're going to have pain. So I went to Tampa, finally found a rheumatologist that she had referred me to, and oddly enough, he did the same blood test and said, you never had lupus, you have advanced fibromyalgia. I said, I just give up. So he said, well, I just don't think you ever had lupus, but for whatever reason, you're able to do what you're doing because of what she gave you. So let's just go ahead and treat you as if it's in remission, but I'm going to treat you for fibromyalgia.
But detail is very, very important. You have to get spellings named, birth dates named, everything. And with me being diagnosed with the neural hearing loss, which has gotten significantly worse I've been checked the last 3 years every 6 months, and it's gotten a lot worse. And now I have the 2 hearing aids that I have to have.
I took the ice pops out thinking they were just the regular ones that I'd been eating earlier. And my mother-in-law had taken my little one over to her house. So my husband and I rented movies, and we were going to have a date night, just night out, night to ourselves. And I pulled out the pops and went on to eat the 4 of the pops, aspartame pops. Well, this was on a Saturday night. By 4 o'clock Sunday morning, I was digging holes in my hands from the itching. I was bleeding. I looked like something out of a Vietnam camp from the bleeding.
The doctor explained that one of the very probable side results would be a loss of short-term memory. Well, I later learned that it had done a little bit more than that with me, in that it ruined my legal career.
About then, I tumbled, but only subconsciously. I said, well, I'm just going to get off this artificial sweetener, and I didn't really even consciously suspect NutraSweet, but when I got off it, then I started recovering.
My doctors will not come out and absolutely put down in writing that this is caused by aspartame. They will not do it. But they'll give me an aside like this, thank God you're off NutraSweet. That's what they'll say, but they won't put it in my records.
We were doing a shelter, and I was there, and I had the water, and that's all I did was drink water. And it was like each bottle I drank, the worse I got. And I had nothing else to eat or anything. There was nothing, nothing else that I was ingesting at all. So that was actually a blessing because I was able to narrow it down. This must be it. And I went around and I had the bottle and I was asking everybody, what's in this bottle? What is aspartame? And, everybody said they had no idea. And then that one lady had said, she goes, I've heard of it, she said. And then something kept flashing my mind, and I remembered seeing the name somewhere. And I like I said, I read all the time in magazines and all that. And I don't know if it was in Time or Newsweek or something, but I remember seeing an article, and for some reason I keep saying that name. So after I had finished the shelter, I went and I was driving down the road, and my library, I volunteer at the library also. And so I stopped in there to say hello and all that and see how everything was going. And they actually had power there. And I went in, I pulled it up on a computer. At that time, I didn't have a computer. And I'd never searched anything in my life, I have no clue. I knew how to email, and that's about it. And I pulled up aspartame, and my eyes lit up. I started crying. All those symptoms, the 92 symptoms, I think I counted 79 of those symptoms. I've been in the hospital or to the doctors and complaints over 50 times for each one of them, well over.
Turns out his wife was told she had lupus. She doesn't. They were getting ready to tell her she had multiple sclerosis, and she didn't. Her husband went home and jumped all over her and made her stop drinking the diet drinks, and all of a sudden things got a lot better for her. Yep. That's basically how it happened with me, Cori. I put the diet drink down, and I didn't touch it again. This was on a Friday. I think it was around the 19th of September.
Last year?
Yeah. And my husband looked at me and he says, the next day, within 24 hours, he says, baby, you're not slurring like you were. You're not falling down like you were either. And over time, it got better and got better and got better.
Because I was such a high user of aspartame through primarily Diet Cokes and Equal, and those are the primary ways, combined with the mountain of evidence and other testimonials of people who have had terrible symptoms of every type of malady that you can imagine. And when they're removed from the aspartame, the symptoms go away. That's what you call strong, if not direct evidence, very strong circumstantial evidence. Judge Wood, the judge I used to work for, the federal judge, in his charge to the jury, when he would give a definition of circumstantial evidence, he would say, if, as you go to bed at night, there's no snow on the ground, and you wake up in the morning and there's snow on the ground, you may reasonably assume that during the course of the night it snowed. That is an example of strong circumstantial evidence. You didn't see it snow. You can't scientifically prove that the snow fell from the sky, but it wasn't there at night, and in the morning it was. Therefore, you may conclude circumstantially that it snowed during the course of the night. And I would say that the evidence of my brain tumors being caused by aspartame are that strong to me.
And then they re-challenge themselves, knowingly or inadvertently. They served something in a neighbor's house that they didn't realize contained an aspartame product. And these set of symptoms and problems promptly recur within hours or a day or two, sometimes within minutes, and it does so repeatedly, then that is more than anecdotal. That is similar like the Koch postulates for infection. You isolate the cause, and then you inject an animal, and you reproduce the problem. And many of these individuals who had been aspartame reactors have tested themselves 5, 10, 20 times, every time getting the same response. And then they realized that this was a legitimate cause and effect relationship.
My personal experience, from my own experience and with patients, is that when somebody who's been poisoned by this goes off it, they very quickly notice an improvement. And they almost equally quickly find out that it isn't over yet. They've got a lot of problems to deal with. And certainly because I had to suffer with this and had patient groups that had to suffer with it, and then I would consult with doctors around the nation who were pretty much expert in the field of environmental ecology, I developed some therapeutic outlooks that people can have to help themselves. But the first thing you've got to learn is to listen to your body. If something's going wrong, try and backtrack to what you had or what you're breathing in your environment or what's going on around you.
But the fact is, this thing has been carefully studied, repeatedly studied, extensively studied, so that, as I said before, the FDA concluded it's one of the most thoroughly tested food additives they've ever seen. And the conclusion is that it's safe.
They had made the claim years ago that they would help and support any legitimate researcher, that they would supply aspartame and be helpful in any research. I had published my anecdotal studies, and I had written a chapter in Richard Wortman's book, so I think the industry knew of my stance already. But then in the mid-90s, I wrote to the company stating that we wanted to do a double-blind study because my earlier work had indeed been, quote, anecdotal. And I pointed out that they had made the claim that they would supply aspartame to any legitimate researcher. At that point, I was a professor near UConn, Northeastern Ohio University's College of Medicine. I think I would qualify as a legitimate researcher. The company, I sent the protocol for the study to the company, and they responded that this was unnecessary research and would not supply us with aspartame. I offered to buy the aspartame. They refused. They put up roadblocks. They made it very difficult for us to purchase aspartame. We had to go around them. We finally did get USP-grade aspartame from Schweitzer, from a private firm, but the point is that the NutraSweet company made it very, very difficult, didn't follow through on their promise to supply aspartame to any legitimate researcher. Said this was unnecessary, shouldn't be done, needn't be done. They tried to block it.
The G.D. Searle Company, in the quest to get approval for their product, aspartame, they conducted a study on animals in which they fed some animals, like I said, low dose, medium dose, high dose of the product, and then they used control animals that supposedly did not get any of the product. When they submitted this to the FDA and the FDA looked at it, there was some question about the study. Well, one of the scientists, a neuroscientist, looked at some of this, and he saw a lot of red flags. He said there's some real questions here about tumors being caused by this product, particularly brain tumors. So they ordered a study to be done by the Bureau of Foods, which was the precursor to the FDA. And Dr. Jerome Bressler was in charge of this group to look through the research that had been done by G.D. Searle, and that's what the Bressler reported about. And this is the report here. Basically what it shows is that either a lot of purposeful shenanigans was carried on to get this product approved, or, as he states it, it was the world's worst research. They found that what they did is the animals that died after being fed NutraSweet, they didn't autopsy the animals right away. Some of them were not autopsied more than a year afterwards. And of course the tissues broke down and liquefied, and so they couldn't do proper studies on them, but they reported it as if they had, and they reported these as normal. They found that they were taking tumors and cutting them out and throwing them away and saying the animal was normal. They had animal tissues that had obvious tumors in it that were reported normal. They had, in one of the cases here that's reported, a lymph node that was enlarged. And this G.D. Searle pathologist reported it as a normal lymph node. When the scientists from the Bureau of Foods looked at it, they said it was an obvious lymphosarcoma, a highly malignant tumor. The notations about the testicular atrophy were not noted. There were just numerous things in this report that showed that, in my estimation, there was an effort to cover up what was being found so that they could get approval.
There were so many things wrong with the submitted data from G.D. Searle originally. They had a monkey study, and in this monkey study, they were fed aspartame, and they were fed aspartame with milk. The milk, as you know, normally slows down the absorption of certain chemicals when you drink milk. If you take aspirin in milk, it'll take much longer for the aspirin to go to work. Well, even though the monkeys were drinking aspartame and milk, out of the 7 monkeys they had, I think 1 or 2 died and 4 or 5 had grand mal seizures. Now, these test results were not satisfactory to G.D. Searle. They weren't going to be able to show these to FDA, saying, hey, look, aspartame, even with milk, caused monkeys to have grand mal seizures.
When we did our double-blind study here at this hospital, we had really a tragic situation which occurred, which I attributed directly to the aspartame. We needed volunteers. We looked at both patients, that is, people who had a history of mood disorder, and we needed some controls, that is, people without a history of mood disorder. One of the people that I used in the study was the administrator for our psychiatric unit, who was a PhD psychologist. And several days into this study, he had an emergency. He had an ophthalmologic emergency. That is, he had sudden bleeding in his eye and a detachment of his retina. He had to be rushed to Cleveland for emergency surgery. His eye could not be saved. He lost the vision in one eye. At the same time, we had another participant in the study, a nurse, who also had an episode of intraocular bleeding, that is, bleeding within her eye. So we had 2 people who, during the course of the study, had eye emergencies.
The bottom line was, here is the most tested product additive in history, an additive. Now, additive's important because aspartame was approved as a GRAS, G-R-A-S, I mean, it's generally recognized as safe product. In which case, unlike drugs, if people have reactions to it, it does not have to be reported to the FDA.
And what I found was really quite frightening, and that was that, yes, there were many, many studies in the literature which did attest to aspartame safety, but they were essentially all funded by the industry, either Searle or the NutraSweet industry or the diet soft drink industry. These were the individuals who sponsored, paid for the studies. There were independent studies, but virtually all of the independent studies, that is, studies which were not funded by the industry, virtually all of them did identify one type of problem or another with aspartame.
And so they got the test results they wanted by manipulating the method. This is not to say that aspartame was safe or that aspartame does not induce seizures, because it does. It's just to show you that the scientific data nowadays is unreliable.
So how you design the study is going to have an impact on the results, and I think that many of the industry-sponsored studies were set up in such a way that the results could be predicted ahead of time and would be supportive of the safety of the product.
Sounds great. We'll see you then. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
There is no evidence at the present time that I'm aware of that aspartame in large amounts has a significant effect on brain chemistry.
Can we go through what exactly an excitotoxin is?
Well, an excitotoxin, basically what it does, it's a normal transmitter in the brain. These are chemicals that allow brain cells to communicate. But if it's in even a minute overconcentration in the brain, it causes the brain cells to become extremely excited. and they become so excited they'll very quickly burn themselves out and die. That was one of the first observations by Dr. Olney, and he gave it the name excitotoxin.
When was the first time that you heard about aspartame? Was it during that investigation with the FDA?
Yes, it was. It was in 1970, and it was an interesting story. I was called by Dr. John Olney from Washington University, who I had been working with on MSG and baby food. We had started an examination of MSG and baby food that led to the baby food industry taking MSG out of baby food. And it was done by the Senate Nutrition Committee. I was the special counsel to the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition. And we ran hearings on food. And one of the things we talked about was MSG in baby food, because it caused holes in the brains of rats that were being tested by Dr. Olney. And there was Dr. Olney's hypothesis that a substantial amount of mental retardation, 95% of which is of unknown origin, that a substantial portion of that came from environmental insults, chemicals in the environment, food, air, water, and so forth. And he was testing them. And one of them was MSG, and it caused these holes in the brains of mice in his system, and ultimately that led to having MSG taken out of baby food. He called me to say that he'd just done a study on aspartic acid, one of the primary components of NutraSweet, and it was doing the same thing as MSG. And that caused him to be quite concerned about the fact that Cyril Drug Company at the time was planning to use this as a sweetener.
But now, after years of retesting this, most authorities agree, there's no question, that feeding MSG to animals produces this brain damage. It's not questioned any longer, it's a fact. There's even good studies to show that if you feed the pregnant animals the MSG, their offspring has impaired brain function, and when you measure the neurochemical analysis of the brain of the animal, it's impaired all the way through the animal's youth up until adulthood, and they never quite recover from it.
In one of the conferences which I addressed for the FDA a few years back, there was a study with MSG, monosodium glutamate, which is another excitotoxin. It's a neurotoxin problem. And we could not understand why with the controls had almost the same number of reactions as the people had given it. But it turned out that one of the presumably inert components in these capsules of products with MSG contained aspartame. So it really was, there was something that even the investigators did not realize was a component of the presumed placebo.
The central mechanism that actually produces the destruction and damage to the brain is excitotoxicity. That's pretty well agreed upon now. The frightening thing is that we're adding tons of these excitotoxins to our food, either in the form of MSG or part of the aspartame molecule, which is aspartic acid, which is an excitotoxin.
Can we talk about the blood-brain barrier and how it breaks down? Like hypoglycemia can be an example of that, and how excitotoxins can pass through that on occasion.
Yeah, the blood-brain barrier is one of the big defenses that the industry always gives. They say, well, these things can't get through the blood-brain barrier. I did rather extensive research in this area, and what I discovered was that there are numerous conditions that we're all subjected to that cause a breakdown of the normal blood-brain barrier. Number one is aging. As we age, our blood-brain barrier begins to deteriorate. It becomes porous, so that anything we eat will pass through the blood into the brain. Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, all of these diseases are associated with a breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. Strokes, even silent strokes, produce a breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. Exposure to certain pesticides, herbicides will break down the blood-brain barrier. Hypoglycemia will break it down. Certain drugs will cause it to break down. Free radical generation will cause it to break down. Well, we know many of the diseases are caused by free radicals, like diabetes. You can have very high free radical levels. Extreme exercise, you produce a lot of free radicals. All of this breaks down the blood-brain barrier. Multiple sclerosis, autoimmune diseases, lupus, all these things are associated with the breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. So we know there are millions and millions of people out there who have at one time or another, a very porous blood-brain barrier. So when they drink a Diet Cola or they eat MSG, it passes right into their brain very easily. The other thing that we discovered was that even if you had a completely normal, intact blood-brain barrier, if you expose that person to a high dose of these excitotoxins over a prolonged period of time, it will seep past the barrier into the brain.
The same building blocks that are found in all of the proteins that we eat, whether they be bananas or meat or peanuts or what have you, they are found in NutraSweet.
Now, the amino acids are contained in food, but if you have protein, meat, fish, and so forth, there may be 4% phenylalanine in the food, but not 50%. And we simply, biologically, don't know how to react to this flooding of these enormous amounts of amino acids in the body, especially the phenylalanine, which crosses the blood-brain barrier that's meant to protect against, biologically, against poisons and so forth.
It's also what's called a dipeptide. That is, it is two amino acids stuck together. One of those amino acids is something called phenylalanine. Phenylalanine is the building block for another important neurotransmitter called norepinephrine. So when you take in aspartame, you will increase the availability of one and you'll decrease the availability of the other. You'll change ratios. And when you do that, when you change ratios of norepinephrine and serotonin, you certainly affect brain function. And this can lead then to mood symptoms, to panic symptoms in some people. It'll affect seizure threshold, which is why I think I saw the seizure in this initial patient back in 1985, and why I saw a lot of seizure activity in people who were taking in a great deal of aspartame.
They knew that this product, aspartame, with time breaks down into a product called diketopiperazine. Diketopiperazine chemically is closely related to a carcinogenic compound that causes cancer in a lot of animals if they're exposed to it, and humans. So they asked the GD Searle company to do a separate study with the diketopiperazine. Well, when they looked at this study, they found some shenanigans as well. And one of the things is when you mix up the diketopiperazine with the animal's food, you have to homogenize it so that it's evenly distributed and the animal can't see it and avoid it. Well, I've seen pictures of the feed, and they left it in big clumps so the rats were eating around it, not actually eating the diketopiperazine. There was also evidence that they were giving the diketopiperazine to the control animals. And of course this came out because in the original study they found a 47-fold increase in brain tumors. In the diketopiperazine repeat study, they said, oh, well look, the control animals and the aspartame-fed animals have the same incidence of brain tumors. Well, when the neuropathologist looked at it, they said, well, that's kind of strange because now your control animals have a very high incidence of brain tumors that's not naturally found in these mice. And then when they looked at the feed, they found out there were some mix-ups of the feed so that the diketopiperazine was being fed to the control animals. These are the sort of things that's in the Bressler report that the makers of NutraSweet would not like the public to know about, because it's very frightening. You know, when the pathologist, Dr. Adrian Gross, looked at the material as well, very well-regarded pathologist, and he looked at it and he was absolutely shocked. He said it's just an enormous increase in tumors, particularly the brain tumors. And of course that's exactly what we're seeing now, is this tremendous increase in brain tumors in this country, which is completely unexplained by the neurological profession.
There is also a methyl group which is found in all fruits and vegetables. Everything that we eat has methyl groups.
When the body metabolizes, when it breaks down aspartame, you wind up with a small amount of methanol, which is wood alcohol. That in turn is broken down into formaldehyde, which the body cannot get rid of, the body stores. Now, the industry has made a big deal about supposedly the fact, it's not really a fact, but what they claim is that when you take in fruit, you take in more methanol. They don't add the fact that in nature, the methanol in fruit is bound to something called pectin. Humans lack the enzyme to split the methanol off from pectin, so it goes through the body without doing any damage whatsoever. The body doesn't get exposed to the methanol because it's bound to pectin. So even though there's more of it, it's totally harmless in fruit. But with aspartame, you have the pure, unadulterated, free methanol and then formaldehyde. It's a small amount, but the body can't get rid of it. It's a cumulative phenomenon. So we have very, very toxic products.
Methyl alcohol is just deadly and probably provides most of the poisoning attributed to ethyl alcohol and alcoholics. It is the deadly one.
Aside from the pectin story, in fruit, in nature, you also are taking in equal amounts of ethanol. You get both methanol and ethanol, and so they counteract each other. And so there's essentially no impact. You're not poisoning yourself when you take in fruit. I believe you're poisoning yourself when you take in aspartame.
What's the difference between methyl and ethyl alcohol?
Okay, it's a difference of one carbon atom. Methyl alcohol has one carbon atom, ethyl alcohol has two carbon atoms. The human metabolism is geared to using carbon atoms in groups of 2 or 3 or more. When you get down to 1, methyl alcohol, wood alcohol, has obligatory metabolism to formaldehyde. Formaldehyde, which is embalming fluid, is 5,000 times as potent a poison as is sipping alcohol.
The FDA, which is the watchdog of American safety that we have empowered to protect the American public against food additives and drugs, has repeatedly reviewed all of the data that has been forthcoming from hundreds of studies about aspartame.
Back in 1965, according to G.D. Searle, one of their researchers was working on an ulcer drug when he happened to get some of the substance on his finger, and instinctively, he licked it, noticing its sweet taste. One of the first tests conducted on aspartame was a 52-week study of monkeys to determine the effects of aspartame on primates. 7 monkeys were fed aspartame with milk. 5 of those monkeys had grand mal seizures, and 1 died.
Monkeys have more of a reaction to ethanol, regular alcohol like vodka or scotch. They have a real high resistance to methanol, and even though they were fed aspartame with milk, they still came down with seizures, and 1 died of, I guess, cardiac arrest from overstimulated nervous system. Searle went back and got another physician, a fellow named Dr. Wellington, and this guy sat down and redesigned the monkey study.
In that same year, Dr. John Olney found that oral intake of aspartic acid could cause brain tumors in mice.
We had this situation where the company initially seemed to be responsive to the concerns, and they actually sent a team of researchers to Dr. Olney's laboratory. And they recreated the studies. The Searle investigators recreated the studies that showed this brain damage in animals. And they went back to Searle, and we waited to hear what Searle was going to do about this. And the next thing we knew, I would say that they probably went to Dr. Olney's lab mid-71. Mid-73, they applied to the FDA for a food additive petition to use NutraSweet as a sweetener. So I called the FDA and I said, this doesn't make any sense.
Dr. Olney was asked by G.D. Searle to conduct a study because there were some concerns. And it's interesting to note that these concerns came up before a lot of the major testing into the toxicity of aspartame became apparent. But my thinking as an FDA investigator is that G.D. Searle already knew that going into this.
Ultimately, FDA, using its good offices, interestingly enough, a major person there, created a meeting between me, Cyril, and General Foods, which was going to be one of the main customers. And we met. And I said I didn't think that this would ever reach the market. And they said, well, they were sure it was going to be approved. And I thought that we were on 180 degrees opposite sides. It turned out that it was approved, but FDA asked them not to market it. And they held it up so that there could be hearings and so forth.
In 1974, the FDA approved the limited use of aspartame. Do you know why they were sure it was going to be approved? You said that they said that it was sure that
Well, see, when I said I don't think it's going to reach the market, I was being very particular, but I didn't believe it was going to be approved because the evidence didn't show. They said it was. Now, one very strange fact in all of that is that I knew that they had the brain damage study from Olney's lab that their own people had done. And we talked about the various pieces of evidence that were problems. And I finally said, what about the brain damage problem from the animals in Dr. Olney's laboratory that your own people have gone and looked at? And he said, we don't think those are going to be a problem. Well, it turned out they weren't a problem because they didn't give them to the FDA. So here they had in their own files a study that raised very serious questions, which they did not give to the FDA. That's a violation of law.
G.D. Searle did not inform the FDA of this study until after aspartame's approval. This approval came despite the fact that FDA scientists found serious deficiencies in all tests related to genetic damage.
And so all these concerns were all rolling around inside FDA, and they were trying to organize them into a policy. And every time they would organize them into a policy at the bench and science level, and they would go up one level to where the policy people were, the policy people would overrule them.
A month later, Olney and Turner filed a formal objection, stating that they believed aspartame could cause brain damage.
But anyway, we filed our petition. Dr. Olney filed one, and I filed one attacking the approval. And the FDA said, right, there are some factual information that we should look into. We'll have a public hearing.
Only because some of the investigators working for the Food and Drug Administration, looking at this data, knew that the data did not contain adequate safety information about aspartame.
In 1975, due to serious questions over the quality and validity of G.D. Searle's testing of aspartame and other pharmaceuticals, the FDA formed a special task force to examine 11 of the pivotal studies on aspartame. Pivotal studies are those upon which the FDA bases approval or disapproval. Of the 113 studies done on aspartame submitted to the FDA by Searle, 90 were conducted in the early to mid-1970s. Every test the FDA called pivotal was part of this 90. In March of 1976, the FDA completed their 500-page report after finishing their investigation.
The report by the FDA team that inspected it is the most devastating report about research that has probably ever been written about a specific company. And that led to a series of hearings in Congress and came up with a $12 million appropriation to FDA to enforce good laboratory practices. But what happened is there's a policy resolution, but NutraSweet and Cyril got bypassed in the sense that they took this all over here and said, look at this terrible thing that's going on. There were a couple others that were going on at the same time. We've got to do something, and they did something. What they did was going forward, you have to meet these requirements. They didn't do anything about going backwards and saying, look, the stuff you came through here is killing people. Now, the reason they didn't do that at the time, because it happened in 75 and 76, is that it was the assumption of everyone in the process that the FDA was going to handle it. So FDA, one of the things FDA did that was so striking and remarkable is that they, knowing that they had this terrible situation on their hands, hired a group of pathologists. It's a pathology research group. FDA hired them to review the Cyril studies, but had Cyril pay for it. So the result was, here's a company which makes its money by being hired and paid for to do studies. Well, why would it do a study that was going to be critical of NutraSweet?
In 1977, the FDA chief counsel, Richard Merrill, recommended to U.S. Attorney Samuel Skinner that a grand jury be set up to investigate G.D. Searle.
Well, FDA did attempt to do something, and it wasn't the political part of the FDA. These were the people that really were trying to work and do well. One of the counsels, lawyers for the Food and Drug Administration, contacted the U.S. Attorney in Chicago and to bring an indictment against G.D. Searle for fraud, for deletion of records, manipulation of records, the falsification of records, and a number of other things on the testing that they did on aspartame and several other products as well.
Suddenly, U.S. Attorney Samuel Skinner began preliminary employment discussions with G.D. Searle's law firm, Sidley and Austin. The U.S. Justice Department urged Attorney Samuel Skinner to proceed with the grand jury, pointing out that the statute of limitations on prosecution would soon run out. Samuel Skinner withdrew from the G.D. Searle case, and Assistant U.S. Attorney William Conlin was assigned to the grand jury investigation. Shortly afterwards, Samuel Skinner left his job to work for G.D. Searle's law firm. The assistant he left behind let the statute of limitations run out on the aspartame charges. This assistant, William Conlin, was hired 15 months later by G.D. Searle's law firm, Sidley and Austin.
The common denominator for all of this, unfortunately, is money. And the amount of money that was flashed around induced people to drop the lawsuit against G.D. Searle and come work for the very firm that they were going to try for illegal activity. And that's what happened with the U.S. Attorney. That's what happened with several people working for the Food and Drug Administration at that time. If they passed aspartame, literally, they were promised great jobs when they finished with FDA.
And it was interesting, the main guy that made the decisions that overruled them in the Bureau of Foods went on to work for the Soft Drink Association. And actually 7 of the key people that made decisions that kept NutraSweet moving through the process ended up working for one or another NutraSweet using industry. That's kind of an interesting side effect to the whole thing.
I like to do well at things. It's important to me that if you're given an assignment that you try to do it the best you can. I'm afraid that some people confuse that with some sort of single-mindedness on my part.
Donald Rumsfeld went into the company after he left Washington, after Ford lost, and that would be in 1977. Is in business, and he was the congressman from there. And then he went to the White House, where he was White House Chief of Staff, and then he became the Secretary of Defense. And he's involved in a whole group of people around Chicago that are, they're involved in a whole range of things, national security being one of them. He was also part of the RAND Corporation, one of the major defense think tanks. He's a very bright guy, like in The Best and the Brightest, you know, the kind of people that brought us Vietnam. These are people who believe that thinking is the primary way that you get through life. Having values, feelings, and so forth, they denigrate. So he took over this company, and it was going down the tubes completely. It had FDA investigations, it had grand jury investigations, it was losing money, its stock was down, a person was hired to come in and explain why the FDA was so down on them, and went through all of their records and said, you guys haven't got a chance, this company is a mess, a total mess. And he went in with a full team of politicians. He went in with himself, a politician. He brought his special assistant, who was a Republican Party operative, worked with the Republican National Committee, brought in a press guy from there, brought in lawyers, and they took on the issue of this company as a political issue. And one of the first things that not first, but somewhere in that first year, it was late in the year, he called me and said, let's have a meeting. So I went and I met with him. We flew into the Madison Hotel and we met and we talked. And my point was that the struggle that was going on around NutraSweet was a scientific struggle. We needed to know the scientific answers. And this was before the Public Court of Inquiry had ruled. We needed to know the answers. So why don't we, the people who were raising all of the questions about NutraSweet and the company, together create a set of protocols that we would agree address the serious questions that needed to be looked at to decide whether or not it should be marketed. So we had this meeting. And for about 6 months, his staff and I and our group negotiated out how we could proceed on this. His own scientists didn't want to do it. For example, at the time that they put their evidence into FDA in 1973, there were no requirements at FDA to examine effects on the brain from food additives. No requirements whatsoever. So there never was a study done to look at whether or not this affected the brain in a neurological sense. The cancer studies were incidental. Those were cancer studies. But these were not brain studies. The cancer studies turned up brain tumors. But they didn't look, for example, at these holes in the brain or mental retardation or lowering the ability of people to think or causing dizziness or blindness or any of those things. None of that was looked at. And we were proposing that we design some studies to look at it. And that was the direction I thought we should go. And I should say that at that point, I was involved with a group of people from the food industry. We had created something called the Food Safety Council. We had 35 major corporations, and it had a board that was half corporate people and half consumer advocates, academic people, environmentalists, and so forth, to look at the standards for food safety. And we had written a whole series of standards for food safety. Basically, what I was saying to Rumsfeld is, why don't you bring your company into the same framework that all these other companies have agreed to be a part of? And we had a very good, very full and frank exchange. His scientists kept jumping up and running around the room and saying, there's no problem, there's no problem, there's no problem. Ultimately, he made the decision not to find out what the facts were, but to move forward on the limited record that they had before them. And I believe it was a decision that was made that said we can accomplish our ends better legally and politically than we can by actually doing the science to determine the outcome of the questions that are being asked. And in my mind, that demonstrated that he was an individual not interested in facts, not interested in the truth, not interested in finding out what the fundamental realities are, but much, much more interested in setting a goal and then by will and force pulling all the resources that he could possibly pull together to achieve that goal, i.e. get NutraSweet on the market and sold.
And so Donald Rumsfeld had been in all these meetings and known all of these potentially very harmful effects of this substance that he then went on and continued to market?
Well, I can't say what Donald Rumsfeld knew or didn't know. He's not a scientist. He's not very interested in science, from what I can tell. More or less, he's a fixer. He's an operative. You assign him a job and he goes and he does it. Now, I'm sure that as he gets up into the level of Defense Department, he sort of makes up his own jobs and says, I'm going to do these things. But facts are not all that important to how he proceeds, because he's so confident that he knows what the outcome should be, that he will look across, at least in the way he did on NutraSweet, he looked across the horizon to find all those facts that would support his position and then minimized or denigrated all the facts that didn't support his position.
In 1980, the Public Board of Inquiry voted unanimously to reject the use of aspartame until additional studies could be done on aspartame's potential to cause brain tumors.
The product was said not to be, it was ruled by law, it was said you cannot market this product. And then they had to go and do political triage and get in there and manipulate the process. So, I mean, the manipulation was so powerful that one of the first things that Ronald Reagan did when he became president was suspend the authority of the FDA commissioner to take any actions. So he was sworn in whatever day in January, and the next day he issued an executive order eliminating the FDA commissioner's authority to take actions. There was obviously a fear on the part of somebody that the commissioner was going to do something about NutraSweet or something else that would create difficulty, because it took him a while to get a new commissioner. It took him a little over a month to get a new commissioner, get the old one out and the new one in. And in that month, the old commissioner was prevented from taking any actions by an executive order. And that takes a high level of political clout to do that. But that's political triage on a situation that had gone sour because Rumsfeld had made the decision to just power his way through and ignore getting the facts.
In 1981, the day after Ronald Reagan took office as U.S. President, J.D. Searle reapplied for the approval of aspartame. Several new studies were submitted along with their application. 3 of the 5 FDA scientists responsible for reviewing brain tumor issues advised against the approval of aspartame. Under the watch of the new FDA commissioner, Arthur Hull Hayes, the panel lawyer assigned a new panel member to eventually achieve a 3-to-3 split over aspartame. On July 18, 1981, Arthur Hull Hayes overruled the Public Board of Inquiry to approve aspartame for use in dry foods.
Furthermore, the FDA impaneled its own panel to review the Public Board of Inquiry. 3 of those people were assigned, review the cancer part of the Public Board of Inquiry, the part that said you can't market it. Those 3 scientists, every single one of them said, we agree with the Public Board of Inquiry. These are 3 FDA senior scientists. We agree with the Public Board of Inquiry. They met with the commissioner the night before he announced that he was going to approve NutraSweet and begged him not to approve NutraSweet.
Animals just ordinarily do not get brain tumors. And this should have been enough to have invoked the so-called Delaney Amendment to the 1958 Food and Drug Act. It says that if something causes tumors or cancer in experimental animals, you should not approve it for human use.
In 1983, the FDA approved the use of aspartame in carbonated beverages. Under charges of improprieties, Arthur Hull Hayes left the FDA and was hired as a consultant for $1,000 a day by G.D. Searle's public relations firm.
NutraSweet, or aspartame, is the most studied food ingredient ever approved by the FDA, and not just by the FDA, but by more than 70 regulatory bodies around the world.
In order to rubber stamp it around the world, you've got to get it approved in another country. Okay, so let's take Europe. If England were to find out that they wanted them indicted for fraud, if they ever read these reports by the CDC or the FDA Board of Inquiry saying it's not safe, or found out, about that they wanted them indicted, naturally they're not going to approve it. So what they did was Searle, the manufacturer, made a business deal with the Professor Paul Turner, who was in the regulatory agency in England, and he approved it without anybody knowing it. Parliament had a big blowout about it, and the story was in The Guardian. I have a copy of it. But they did not rescind the order. There were no studies done in the UK, and it was rubber stamped. Then, around the world, they could say, well, it was approved in the United States, it was approved in Europe, and then it was approved, in other places. They tried to get it approved in Canada, and they couldn't do it. But once they got it approved in Europe, they began to rubber stamp it around the world.
The American Dietetic Association, the American Diabetes Association, the American Medical Association, goes all the way down the line. And if you were to see and read their journals and publications and see who the sponsors were and the people who were paying a great deal for advertising therein, it would make a little bit more sense.
But the Center for Disease Control did an investigation and said it was safe.
No, the Center for Disease never said it was safe either. What they did, here is the Center for Disease Control investigation. And it's a 146-page document. What it goes into, what was happening to the people, goes into cardiac arrest, it goes into seizures, it goes into liver problems, it goes into mood alteration, and it goes into death. And it ends up by saying that more neurological studies need to be done. Now here's what happened. If you go to the Center for Disease Control website, you will see a summary, not this 146-page investigation, but a summary that contradicts this report, saying that it was just mild findings. And I told Dr. Satcher before he left the CDC and became Surgeon General, I said, if you don't take that phony summary off, I will put the whole 146-page investigation on web and let the world see what the Center for Disease Control did. And we do have it on www.cdc.gov. DORWAY.com, like doorway with one O. You can read this entire investigation, and this is the original document.
Betty Martini and her organization, Mission Possible, have served as a lighthouse for people who suspect their toxin to be aspartame and wish to learn more. For over 10 years, she has worked tirelessly to inform people of this issue, often challenged by the pharmaceutical and food industries. Mission Possible is the central hub for prevailing knowledge of aspartame. Betty Martini and Mission Possible contribute to Doorway.com, a website that is likely the most frequently cited internet source on this issue. A substantial find in my investigation was Betty Martini. Her work is an act of charity, and her sources are credible.
And of course, as the case histories came in on the internet, and they were just coming in so fast, that one day I got 12,000 case histories of people suffering from aspartame and crashed my computer. So 4 support groups have been set up on the internet to take care of these people, because finally they wondered. They'd been going from doctor to doctor. They read that, and they realized why they had MS. They realized about lupus. They realized about diabetes. Many of them called just hysterical, crying, could this be true? Could this be true? But as they got off, their MS symptoms disappeared. People that were blind could see again.
Now the current philosophy within the Food and Drug Administration is, let's go ahead and we'll approve this food additive or whatever is in here, and we'll let the people prove that it's dangerous.
They were calling the FDA, they were calling the hospitals, the doctors, they were calling the CDC. I got one email from the CDC, and they said, people are calling over here, they're hysterical about this. I said, well, whose fault is it? You did the most damning investigation ever done. I said, and then you put this phony summary up there instead of, you should be doing what I'm doing. You are the Center for Disease Control, and we're having to alert the world, because you people sold out.
And then you get up with this very terrible equation that says, well, if this thing only harms 1 in a million people, we'll consider it to be safe. Now, harms, they say kills. If it kills only 1 in a million people, the FDA considers it to be safe. So what you have then, by virtue of that, is you're saying that as far as we're concerned, something that kills between 200 and 300 people a year, we consider safe. That doesn't work for the 200 or 300 people. And so if you're going to do that, you better have a label somewhere that says safe means we'll kill no more than 200 or 300 people a year.
And I want to pose that to people, because I've had a conversation with some other federal regulators, and I said, with all the technology we have today, with all the advances in medicine and science, people are getting sicker. Has anyone noticed that? People are buying more pharmaceutical drugs to cure the very things that these chemical companies started to begin with. So I'm thinking, from the womb to the tomb, you're going to be paying money to these pharmaceutical companies, and they're going to be manipulating the politics so you get to consume all of their poisons, all of the toxins, things that are totally untested. And we're going to see 5 or 6 years from now people coming down with new kinds of diseases, things that we've never even heard of today.
You have to take some responsibility for what you're putting in your mouth. But in this case, they have no way of knowing. You got the FDA lying to them. They got the CDC, the professional organizations. They go to the doctors. The doctors can't help them because they've been lied to too.
Doctors only know what they're taught, and they only believe what they're allowed to believe. So I think it was the year 1917, but I could be wrong. Somewhere in that era, they developed the electrocardiogram. The year before, indigestion was the #1 cause of death in the United States. The year after the electrocardiogram was invented, myocardial infarction was the #1 cause of death in the United States. So a lot of doctors are still back on the NutraSweet issue. They're still way back in the era before anybody allowed them to know anything wrong with it.
So many of these things are prolonged effects, and of course if a physician sees it and they see a child with a seizure, they're not going to connect it to the MSG or aspartame because they don't know about this research. They're not familiar with it. they'll just tell the mother, well, I don't see how that could be related, you know, something you drank when you were pregnant.
We're about ready to meet Diane Fleming, who was convicted of murdering her husband by methanol poisoning. Her attorney neglected to mention that he was a big her husband was a big consumer of aspartame products, and aspartame breaks down into methanol and could have been the cause of his death rather than her. That's a possibility that was never brought out in court, and therefore she got 50 years in this prison. We're about ready to meet her and hear her side of the story, so stay tuned. Describe your husband to me. Tell me what he was like.
Well, he kept to himself a lot. I don't think a lot of people knew him real well. You know, he didn't want to socialize with people at work or anything. He was very driven at work. Like, he never missed work, even the morning in question when he got up sick. And he's saying, oh, I feel terrible. But he went to work because that's what he did. We had a weight machine. We had stair climber. We had treadmill. And he read everything he could find about how to the right way to do weights, and you know, like you do sets instead of just doing it. You know, you do so many repetitions and stop for a minute and then do it again like 3 times or something like that. He was pretty much obsessed with building his body. He didn't want to be fat like his relatives. He started reading about creatine and said that he wanted to try it, and he talked about it for a while beforehand. And apparently what it does is it pulls pulls water to the muscles to pump them up more.
I was wondering exactly what it was.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a good idea, messing with the fluid balances in your body, pulling water from one place, putting it someplace else. But, and I think it had something to do with the recovery time, and he wanted to try that. But we picked up some Gatorade. He was trying to decide what to put it in, because you could mix it in, they said water or fruit juice, but water probably wouldn't taste too good, and he didn't drink fruit juice. So he said, well, maybe Gatorade. He thought he could tolerate that. So we got the 20-ounce bottles, like a case. I guess it was 24. It was assorted flavors. He kind of tasted it, see how it tasted, and then set it in the fridge. And went to the pool with our daughter and came back. Well, then he played basketball from about 4 until 7 with the guys, mostly some guys from church. And they would meet at the middle school. And came back and drank that. Even when he came back from playing ball, he wasn't feeling good, but it was very hot. That month, that summer, it got hot early. Even in May and early June, it was really hot. And he always felt lousy. But I'm short of breath, I can't breathe. He was like, lay down, get up. And, he said he couldn't breathe. So I kept saying, well, do you want me to, do you want me to call the doctor again? Do you want me to take you to the hospital? What do you want me to do? And this went on for about a half an hour, I guess. And finally he said, okay, you can call the ambulance. Because he, I guess, finally started
feeling that bad.
Feeling bad enough, because you know how men are. They won't go for anything. So called the ambulance, and he was showing some signs of maybe being a little bit disoriented, but he was still talking and everything, answering the questions. The paramedics thought, kind of what I did, that he was dehydrated from throwing up so much, and that his electrolytes might have been out of whack, because they said, well, we need to get some fluid in you and get some electrolytes. And his breathing was real fast. They, tried to get him to slow his respirations down. They said he was hyperventilating, and they thought that was a lot of his problem. And they put him in the ambulance and, transported him. And about, after we'd gotten out of our neighborhood and into
May I have your attention? It's 5 minutes to count, 10:34, 10:56 hours.
And through the other neighborhood, we were still kind of going on the back roads, they turned the lights on, and that kind of scared me because there wasn't traffic. It was, so we were crossing over the lake. They turned the lights on. But I called his parents in after I'd done all the paperwork. You know, they took him on back, but I had to give them the insurance information and everything. They eventually called me back there, and he was still conscious, but he was way incoherent. You know, he wasn't making any sense, and he was real, like, wanting to get up off the gurney and everything, and they finally had to give him some Ativan IV to calm him down because he wouldn't stay, you know.
And what's that?
Ativan is, it's in the same family as Valium. Wound up putting him then in the MICU, Medical Intensive Care Unit. By the time he got up there, he wasn't really conscious anymore, but then they had pumped him full of Ativan too, so it's hard to say. You know, I don't know at what point, really, I'm not on Zoloft anymore, so I don't know at what point he really went into a coma, you know, and when it was the Ativan. I know that night I mentioned to him that he wore the extended wear lenses, and even though you sleep in those things, you know, the nurses don't usually like for patients to have them in. I know they make you take them out. Usually that's one of the things they ask you, and I brought it up, so they said, well, would you take his lenses out, you know, and he kind of responded to that, you know, like whenever I was trying to remove his lenses, which is really hard to do on another person. During the course of it, you know, when we were going over, you know, trying to, you know, figure out everything, I told him that he had been complaining of shortness of breath for a few weeks. About in early May, he started complaining of shortness of breath. And the first week or two of May, he had a stress echo. I finally got him to go to our doctor, and he ordered a stress echo. And early the next morning, the doctor called and said that they'd already gotten the toxicology back, which they weren't expecting that for a long time. They said it would take, you know, a couple of days, which sounds kind of bad. And they said they'd gotten it back and they found methanol in his system. Apparently, your body doesn't metabolize methanol. Is what they were telling me, and then I read up on it. As soon as they told me that's what it was, I started reading up on it too, on the internet. Your body can't metabolize methanol like it does ethanol. When it tries to, it breaks down into formaldehyde and maybe some other things, but the formaldehyde is what is really bad. So what they do is to try to, the same enzyme that in your body that works on the methanol is the same enzyme that breaks down ethanol, the kind of alcohol that you drink. So the treatment is to infuse ethanol intravenously, and then your body, instead of working on the methanol, it kind of leaves it alone and works on the ethanol. That gives them time to try to use dialysis and stuff to get the methanol out of your system. Well, they kept saying they weren't able to get his blood alcohol level up enough. And even though they were taking into consideration that he was a drinker, you know, apparently drinkers, you know, you can handle more alcohol, your body works with it better. So they, you know, gave him more than what they would have a non-drinker, but they said they didn't feel like they were able to get his blood alcohol level up enough. So they were doing the dialysis. I think they started him on that the very next day, I believe, the second day. They started him on the dialysis. But, you know, he just wasn't responding at all. He just, you know, like I said, you know, then they decided he was in a coma at some point, I guess, because after the Ativan wore off and he still was unresponsive. They did a CAT scan and said that he had suffered a major brain bleed. A brain bleed, and the size and location was such that he said no one could survive that, even if they were successful in getting the methanol out of his body, that because of the bleeding in the brain, that wasn't. So they started talking about discontinued life support. And we talked about it. That was on that Wednesday. And they kept assuring us that there was no way, even if they kept treating the methanol, that because of the brain damage, that there was nothing that could be done. So I wanted to wait until give it another day. Well, I was the one that called the police. That morning, that Wednesday morning, when Dr. Akers, he called me before I got there. It was before 7:30. I was getting Megan ready for school. He said, "We think this may have been a poisoning, an intentional poisoning, and you need to get the police involved." I'm like, how do I do that, So I said, okay, even though that afternoon before, the decision about removing life support, I met the police. They asked me to come back to the house so they could look for possible sources. Specialists have looked at it now, said that the amount of diet drinks that he consumed would easily account for the levels of methanol that he had in his body. I think drinking the creatine just kind of must have pushed it over the edge, Adulteration of a substance and first-degree murder. And the jury gave me 20 years on the adulteration and 30 on the murder, and the judge ran them concurrently.
We're all human, people are human, and people like to believe that 12 people on a jury found her guilty, so she must be guilty. No way, I have argued that since day one, and I still do not understand what those people could have possibly heard in those testimonies. You read the transcript. What could they have heard that could possibly have convinced them that Diane Fleming could have killed her husband?
I included Diane Fleming in my journey because chronic methanol toxicity from aspartame was not considered at all in her case. Instead, they chose to prosecute her for supposedly pouring a sealed bottle of blue windshield wiper fluid into Gatorade to poison her husband. While there is no way that I can definitively state the precise or exact cause of my own condition, I did drink 6 to 10 cans of diet soda per day for 20 years, and when my body told me to stop, I eventually got better. I can also state that I've spoken to healthcare professionals who agree with me that aspartame is a probable culprit. When I first embarked upon this journey, a part of me was expecting to return empty-handed. What I uncovered, however, was that the current measures of food safety are failing us.
So what do we do today?
We drove. and drove and drove. And now we're going to drive some more.
What would you say to the makers and manufacturers of aspartame now, if you could?
I think they owe me a fortune. They owe me an apology. But they owe me a fortune. I live on Social Security disability. I have nothing left. I'm very heavily in debt. I am trying very hard to start my own business, but that in itself takes money that I don't have. So I'm doing it bits and pieces as I can.
But after that, just each day was just better and better and better. I'm still finding things that it's in because they don't label it very well, and that is very, very aggravating because you have to read each label, and I've got 3 kids and everything, and I don't have a whole lot of time to go spending a year and a half in the grocery store to do a week's worth of groceries and reading every label that I get my hands on.
I've been into chat areas and talked to people with multiple sclerosis, and they're very, very hostile to people like me. So I don't tout it too much.
All the while, I've learned that there is a very safe sweetener